Kia ora whānau, it's so good to see you all again. You know, it's interesting, at home we've got 2 cats. And it always amazes me that when you close a door, the cat goes and sits outside the door. The cat knows what's on the other side of it, you know, and but yet they insist on waiting outside the door. But unlike the cat, the coming of a new year, you don't necessarily know what's on the other side of the door. You know, that's the thing. For some people, it's quite straightforward. It's just like another day. For others, it's quite daunting as to what the new year will hold. And so advertisers like to really get hold of us in that regard. And so you find that quite often in the lead up to Christmas and until the middle of January, there are all these suggestions that they like to make. You know, that with the new year, that maybe it's time for a new you. This new you idea may cause you to find yourself thinking about the need to work on your fitness and your health. The advertisers will suggest that the latest ways to help you do this, and sometimes they can be quite persuasive. You may be thinking, I should probably buy a program or an app for my digital device, and that'll help me along with my fitness. An app is a bit like, for those of you who don't know, an app is a bit like cookies on a computer, not to be confused with cookies that we eat. But cookies on a computer are files that are created by websites. And once you tend to go and Google something, you find that forever you're getting answers to the question that you might have asked several weeks ago. Did you know that if you do a Google search around the area of exercise, that you'll get all kinds of things that will come up. It'll ask you about diets. It'll be all the latest and greatest things that are out there that you need to become the new you. And of course, you can go down the track and you can buy the apps, and you can get apps that will allow you to count every step that you make, and sometimes there's 4,000 or 10,000 steps a day, and you can find yourself walking round and round in circles just so that you can make up the count of the steps that you have to do that the app requires. As well as this, you can get programs that will help you listen to your favourite music while you're walking or running. You know, you could perhaps even maybe listen to a message from Central Baptist, or your favourite Bible passage be read out. One thing that I came across, it's a fad, and it's more in America and in Europe, is ice baths. Now, they're kind of like a spa pool, but they're cold. And the idea of this is that you've done some activity, or you're hot and everything like that, and you've done some exercise, and you go and you hop in this frozen ice bath, which jolts your system and is supposed to be really good for your health, apparently. I don't know about that. I think that for me, if I was looking at fitness, I'd probably think, maybe I should buy a power tool. You know, a hedge trimmer or a brush cutter or something like that. And I could get out there and that would give me good arm movement, you know, up and down, you know, if you're trimming and things like that. That would be really good. And it's a good way of keeping the garden tidy. But there are so many to choose from. Like all of these things, there's just lots and lots of things to choose from. Last year, I got myself an exercycle. Well, actually, it's not really a whole exercycle. It's like a half exercycle. You have to provide the seat. So you provide the seat, and then you sit in the seat, and you put this thing in front of you, and you, with your feet, it gives you exercise. And it does the job, but you don't really gain a lot of advantage out of it. I get more advantage out of it if I go for a long walk. Now, if you continue to listen to the advertisers, they'll tell you that fitness is only part of it. You really have to get into diet. Now, according to the actor Rob Lowe, who seems to be coming up on a lot of YouTube channels or social media things when you're watching something, he'll tell you that what you need is the new improved Atkins diet. Now, apparently, that's what you need. And so you can download apps, programs onto your digital device that will allow you to look at what you should be eating and how you can eat. But the problem with this is that sooner or later you realize that your digital device is filled up with all these applications and programs that you've downloaded in order to be the new you. And all you've done is use up disk space. And you haven't really gained anything from it. But then maybe your New Year's plan is to read more. Maybe you're going to get a book list together of all the books that you'd like to read this coming year. Now, I've tried that. I'm actually still reading some of the books from last year that was on last year's book list. The point is that before you know it, you can become so overwhelmed with all the things that the advertisers have suggested that you should be doing or that you think you should be doing. And the reality is that the difference between 2022 and 2023 is just a day. I don't know about you, but when I woke up on the 1st of January 2023, there really was no significant change from 2022, other than I was now in 2023. Yet as I thought about it, and as I prayed on the 1st of January, I wondered that if instead of rushing off into the year with all the things that I thought that I needed to do, maybe I should just try focusing on one thing. And as I pondered this thought, I was reminded about Paul's letter to the Philippians, where in chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, he says the following. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. Whenever I read that passage of Scripture, those verses really speak to me because it brings back memories of when I was a bit younger. So I can relate to the example that Paul is using as I used to compete in athletics. And this is written to the Philippians, and part of their culture there was athletics going on, and so they understood the language that he was using. And recently, I had the opportunity to catch up with one of my friends who I used to go jogging with. In fact, there were 3 of us back then. And in this context, I'm going to refer to them as Gary and Ben. Now, I just want to tell you about them because it relates to one thing. Gary was a very competitive, long-distance runner. He was part of the local Harriers Club, and he normally finished his races in the top 5. And of course, he won several of those races as well. Gary would train 5 out of 7 days a week. Whereas myself, I'd previously run competitively in the 1500 metres and cross country, where I would normally finish in the middle of the pack. But recently I'd got into surfing at that time, and so running for me was really about keeping fit. It was part of my surfing training. And so I used to run a couple of times a week. Now, Ben didn't run. In fact, he never ran anywhere. Ben had a 10-speed bike. His bike lived in a shed, except on a Sunday morning. On a Sunday morning at 6 o'clock, 6 a.m. in the morning, he would get his bike out. And that's when he would ride it, so that he could join Gary and myself as we ran from the heights of Massey in West Auckland, and we would run down into Henderson, out the back of Henderson, out the back to the top of the scenic drive, which is up in the Waitakaris. Now, if I was to illustrate our run in a local context, using local landmarks, it would be like this. Gary would be starting at Glen Burvey School, running past Pihi Awiri Marae and down to the Tikipunga Post Shop Dairy. There, I'd join the run. Then we would have to run down Tiki Hill towards Central Baptist Church, where Barry would be there on his bike ready to join us. From there, we'd go out to Onarahi, out the back of Whangarei Heads, and we would go up to the top of Count Manaia. That would be the equivalent of what we were doing. Our run wasn't a short run, but we were all committed to it. It was a 3-hour round trip, and Gary was the first to leave home at 6 a.m. I'd join him as he came past my place a few kilometres later, and we'd come across Ben on his bike. It was never a race, and we found a comfortable pace that we could all travel at together. The aim was to arrive at our destination together. When we got to the summit, which was the halfway point, we'd stop briefly, we'd have a drink, and we'd pray. And then we would head towards home, each one of us departing as they arrived at our homes. Gary was always the first to start, and he was the last to finish. Ben, well, he was the last to start and always the first to finish. And I started in the middle and I ended up in the middle. The next time we'd see each other would be an hour later at church in the morning service, where we were all refreshed from our outing together. When I look at Paul's letter to the church in Philippi, especially his illustration to the Philippians, I want to make the following observations when I compare it to running. As an athlete, when you run a race, you know that only the fastest person is going to win that race. So the question that comes to mind for some people, if they think, well, if that's the case, why would you enter the race? Why would you join the race? Well, it's actually all about improving. That's why you keep straining to what is ahead. If you normally get last place, then with your training, you're actually aiming to improve your place. It's not about looking back. You keep looking forward as you're running. Runners don't look back. I remember a number of years ago, I was at Mount Smart Stadium and I saw Dick Quack's race John Walker. They were part of a bigger race. And I remember that Dick Quacks turned to look to see where John Walker was. And as he turned this way to see, John came up on the other side of him, passed him, and sprinted down the home straight and won the race. You never look back when you're running. Runners don't concern themselves about where they've been, or because otherwise you might trip up if you're too busy looking back. Instead, you're focused on where you're heading. Paul's letter also reminds us it's also about learning to run with other people. The lead runner normally sets the pace, and the aim of everyone is to keep up with that pace. Personally, I think Paul is encouraging the church at Philippi, using this example of a race, urging them not only grow in their relationship with Christ, but to help the newer Christians by building them up. That's training them. That's guiding them. It's supporting them to become strong in their faith. Just as an athlete trains their body to become stronger. And it's about setting a pace that they can all run at together. So individually and corporately, they all achieve the goal and win the prize. Since catching up with my friend Gary, I thought a lot about walking and running. A wise man that I know of once talked about the pace that God travelled at. Now in Genesis, we read that God walked in the garden. And throughout the Gospels, we note that Jesus walked. He walked on land and he walked on water. But Jesus never ran anywhere. Jesus always walked. And if we look at the whole of the Bible, God 99.9% of the time walks. I say that because there is one occasion where he doesn't walk. He runs. Does anybody know where that is? The prodigal son, that's right. In the prodigal son we find in Luke 15:20 it says, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion, and he ran to his son, threw his arms around him." So my question is this, as I head into the new year. If God's pace isn't running, why do we often feel the need to run? Or the need to sprint around trying to get things done? All we really have to do is keep in step with the Spirit. That's all we have to do. We don't need to walk ahead of Jesus. We don't need to walk behind. We just need to keep in step with the Spirit. Remember, God is not in a hurry. I mean, just think about it. Just look, how long did it take for him to send Jesus after the incident with Adam and Eve in the garden? That was a very long time. Why do we think God is in a hurry? Because sometimes we do. So often that's why we think we should hurry. But we need to learn to walk at God's pace, keeping in step with the Spirit. One of my favourite psalms is Psalm 127. And verse 1 reminds us that unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labour in vain. And unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards that stand watch in vain. So I say to you, look after yourself, and like the runner, pace yourself. If you're thinking about doing something, ask yourself, is this just a good idea, or is it a God idea? I remember back in 2012, I went to a pastor's conference. And during the breaks, in each session, there were several pastors who came up to me one by one and told me that they believed that God was going to bring someone very special into my life. Well, at the time, I couldn't really see that happening, and I was too busy anyway. But some weeks later, one Sunday afternoon, after leading a service at church, I got home and I had some time to myself, and so I decided just to have a nap, just to relax, just to rest. And I awoke from my sleep with the thought that I needed to read Psalm 68, verse 6. And I can tell you, I wasn't really that familiar with that psalm. But verse 6 says, God sets the lonely in families, and he leads out the prisoners with singing. Now, those words really spoke to me because I realised that while I was living alone, and that God had freed me from my spinal injury, maybe, just maybe, what my fellow colleagues had been sharing with me at the pastors' conference was in fact a God idea. Now, I didn't overly go and act on it or anything, but it was really only a matter of a few weeks after that I met Diane. And I can definitely say that was a God idea. So this year, as we get back into the swing of things and as life gets busy, can I just encourage you? Let's take a walk with God. Let's walk at his pace. And let's be open to God's ideas. And if that is the one thing that we can do this year, then we'll not only see our own lives transformed, but we'll see the lives of others in our families, in our community transformed as well. Bless you all.